That's pretty cool. I remember seeing that on some of my old comic books. Wonder what it means. Oh, why don't people know about this? I guess I'll do it.
All right, let's do this one last time.
The Comics Code Authority was an association established in 1954 as the result of intense panic leading to a congressional hearing about the impact of comic books on the youth. Established to avoid government intervention, the authority's main goal was to ensure that any comics sold to the general public would be appropriate for the children reading them. The driving force behind this movement was a psychiatrist by the name of Frederick Wortham, who published a book speculating that comic books were a direct cause of an increase in violence among children. This may sound familiar to many of you. Whether you play video games or go on social media like TikTok, this type of speculation is inevitable for anything that's popular among minors. In general terms, there are two sides to the debate. Those who want to, quote-unquote, protect the children from bad influences in media, and those who are against censorship in media in the interest of independence. It's hard not to sympathize with the former. I don't have any children, but I can imagine that if I were told that their comic books were making them more likely to hurt their friends, I would definitely want something to be done about it. Many of the population that supported the code were those who worked closely with children, whether they were parents, librarians, or educators. And despite their good intentions, the Comics Code all but destroyed the industry as it was. It gentrified many genres and completely erased a few others, like horror comics. The extreme guidelines of the Comics Code were imposed upon the entire industry with absolutely no leeway, and the businesses suffered. So while the intentions behind the Comics Code were rooted in positivity, it ended up ruining the perception of an entire medium and completely disrupting the industry. First off, it's worth mentioning that the psychiatrist behind the movement, Frederick Wortham, had almost no real evidence to support his claims. He stretched the truth and published misleading information, leading many to believe that his ideas were supported by evidence, even though they weren't. He loosely used violence rates and the reading rates of comic books and assumed that they were a cause and effect rather than a random correlation. His execution of this was not only completely irresponsible, but also kind of evil. His false claims led to countless people in the comic book industry losing jobs and a ton of people losing their favorite fiction medium. His book influenced many specific rules of the code, such as the banning of homosexual relationships and characters after he speculated that Batman and Robin were in a homosexual relationship. And rules like these ruined the industry that previously was filled with complicated stories that oftentimes had a message. After the code, publishers had a really hard time finding genres that they could publish that would still be interesting to read to general audiences under the code. They had trouble for a while, and then they revisited the superhero genre, which had fallen off after World War II. The resurgence of the superhero genre can be viewed as a positive outcome of the code, but in reality, it was more of a happy accident. If the superhero genre was meant to come back, it should have come back naturally and because people had genuine interest in it. The fact that the resurgence of superheroes was caused by a naive association that was harshly censoring an industry just doesn't sit right with me, and it makes reading old Marvel or DC comics a little bit more uncomfortable because I know that they weren't made because the writer actually wanted to make them. Obviously, the comic book industry didn't know exactly what they were doing when they established the authority. It was an overcorrection based on naivety and false claims. Many certainly could have and still could make the claim that comic books should have been regulated, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree. Sometimes it's good to make sure an industry doesn't go too far, or at least if they do, to make sure to sell those to adults only. Unfortunately, at the time, that wasn't very plausible. Most, if not all, comics were sold at newsstands and grocery stores, and after the code, those locations would only sell comics that were approved by the Comics Code, leaving adults with nothing to read. This led to adults being phased out of comic book readership, as well as many young girls whose favorite genres became generic. Before the code, comics were read and loved by everyone, with adults reading more issues than kids and girls sometimes reading more than boys. But since the code made the primary focus of the industry superheroes, adults and girls lost interest. This led to the common misconception that remains today that comic books are for boys and for children. This is extremely sad, not only because it leaves out many people who would potentially love comic books, but it also sets a precedent that the industry still hasn't fully gotten over. Given this misconception, it just doesn't make much commercial sense to make a comic book that's for adults, even though the potential for a great comic book that's more serious is great. The code's authority over the industry faded over time, but the effect is still apparent, and we can only hope that the industry can correct itself and this medium can live up to its potential, because there are amazing stories to be told that are complex and real, that will be best told in the form of a comic book. So now you know, I guess, comic books are insanely underrated, largely due to the Comics Code Authority, which had full control over the industry and what was published for years after its establishment. Many great comics were published during its rule, and many great comics were published after, but all of it means so much less since there are less people willing to read those great stories. If you take anything from this video, I hope it's that maybe you should give comic books a chance, because there are some seriously impactful stories out there that have nothing to do with superheroes, and anybody can enjoy them. There have been countless comics published for people of any cultural background, any interests, any gender, any age. Not to mention the amazing artwork shown in these books, and some amazing writing as well. If any of this sounds good to you, I suggest that you just search up how you may want to start reading comic books, because it's not as hard to start as you may think. I will leave a list of some of my personal favorite and recommended comic books in the description for anyone interested.